It's orange and blue today for this beautiful Friday. In some places, it's beautiful where I am. It's snowy where Jake Shapiro, my co-host for the day, is. I'm Andrew Mason. Cecil Lammy is on assignment, as the late great Herb Brown would say, and Jake Shapiro wearing a Chicago Blackhawks sweater. Is that okay? Is that Tays? Who have you got? Who you repping today?
Yeah, I had to go Jonathan Tays the day after his last game with the Chicago
Mm-hmm.
Blackhawks. Felt only right, one of the most accomplished hockey players of his generation. It's weird, Mace, because I came in here and I didn't expect anyone to see what I was wearing today. Like, I was only coming in here for radio hits. And next thing I know, I've done 2 live shows and I've been on a bunch. Actually, I've done 3 live shows now. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's
Uh,
how it happens.
that's the thing. Whatever you wear, you in this day and age, you have to be prepared to accept going on camera with it. That's the thing, because you can be called in at any time, especially here at denversports.com.
That's just how we roll, Mace. We roll with the punches and we make it work. So happy to be here with you. Happy to talk Broncos with you, and hopefully we'll have a good show.
Well, what we do is we're always shifting gears. I just heard you, of course, over on the radio side, chopping it up on all things Nuggets with Orlando and DMAC. Of course, the playoffs start Sunday. Time to be determined, as you mentioned on air. Just
Mace,
because it says 8:30, that
I
doesn't
think I'm
mean
having an
starting.
all-time day because I obviously am on coffee break with Rachel every single
Yeah.
day. And then I did the Rockies podcast, which is still up in the studio here. And then I was on Stoke and Zach for Avs.
hmm
Then I wrote about the Nuggets. Then I talked about the Nuggets on the radio. And now I'm hosting our Broncos show with you. So I've covered. I mean, me and you can get into rapids too if we just need to finish it off.
Well, I mean, I don't think people are expecting that kind of football. They're expecting the gridiron football. And of course, we, as always, are brought to you by our good friends over at Panda. So let's go in this. Of course, we know the Broncos have been quiet, they've gone underground. But we're sitting here now under 2 weeks out from the draft starting. And in fact, 2 weeks from today will be day two of the draft. If the
Wow.
Broncos don't make any audacious moves, and we'll get into the notion of an audacious move later on in the show, but if they don't make any audacious moves, they'll be going on the clock in about 2 weeks and 3 hours from now as we record this. And this is going to be a fascinating draft, Jake, because even though George Payton is still the general manager, we know who is in charge over there in football operations, who has the bigger voice, and that's Sean Payton. And the two of them historically have really differing philosophies. The Saints, when Sean Payton was there, of course, they had Mickey Loomis as the GM, but we know there that Sean Payton was really the period that ended the sentences there. The Saints were known for trading up in the draft to the point where nobody in those 16 years Sean Payton was in New Orleans, nobody had fewer draft picks than the New Orleans Saints, and it wasn't even close between them and Team 31 in terms of draft picks overall, because they were always looking to turn, to take a third and a fourth round pick and make it a late second round pick. That's the kind of deal that they love to make. George Payton, on the other hand, believes in the more darts philosophy,
Right.
wherein it doesn't even matter if it's later on in the draft. He likes to accumulate picks. Like, you go back to the video that the Broncos posted a couple years ago when he was negotiating to move up for Javonte Williams. A big part of that was he wanted to get a late round pick back, so he left that deal with the same number of draft picks as he had going in. Like, oh, you give us a sixth or seventh round pick. It doesn't matter all that much. So you've got these two philosophies that are kind of in conflict. And George Payton himself said 2.5 weeks ago at the league meetings, they're more likely to trade down than trade up because they only have the 5 picks. But Jake, I gotta ask you, when it comes down to it, 2 weeks from tonight, who do you think's going to win philosophically?
Well, this is an interesting question, Mace, for a variety of reasons, because it shows a little hint at the power dynamics in the relationship as well. Uh, Ultimately, I would say that both have been successful in their philosophies to differing degrees. I think where George Payton has done well is actually later in the draft with those later picks, whereas Sean Payton obviously has succeeded with the quality towards the top. Now, what I would hate for to happen for the Broncos to be stuck between two philosophies and try to do both, because that's when teams really start to struggle and start to do some stupid things. What I personally think the Broncos need is a lot of help in a lot of different places, and that tends for me to think that they need to trade back and get more quantity, but you're also in a win now mode, and that quantity later tends to maybe take a year or two or maybe even 3 to really impact your roster right away. And right now, we're all saying the Broncos need to turn this thing around right now. They've got Russ. They've got these things. The salary cap's going to be increasing, and it's not going to be a pretty number. So part of me understands why they would say we need to bring a singular or 2 assets into this team and just try to go all out and continue to just try this quick turnaround, which would back what they did in free agency.
Yeah. So how do you do that? Now, I guess the question is, how do you do that without trading players currently on the roster? Because to me, if they're going to move up and do anything substantial, it can't simply be trading 2/3 to get into the second. It has to involve a player, or it has to involve a future pick. And where it gets interesting with the future picks is just reading between the lines of what Greg Penner said at the league meetings, where he talked about the expenditure in free agency this year, but very strongly implied that this was a one-off because they didn't have draft capital, that he expected future years to be more balanced. And if you're going to have that kind of balance, you can't go trading from your 2024 draft capital in order to make a short-term move right now.
And it would make sense that this would be the anomaly year when you do bring in a new coach and the new ownership is actually getting its chance to put its hands on the roster and stuff. Like, if there was ever going to be roster turnover and things you would do for the first time and maybe never again, it would be this year. So I believe them when they say that. And generally speaking, Mace, me and you have covered all the sports. And in all the sports, it's awesome to get free agents. It's fun to get the names. Generally speaking, the teams that win the offseason and get the names and spend all the money don't end up doing that well, and they hamstring themselves in the future. So if they're looking at this from a sustainability point of view, yes, you're going to want to continue to build draft assets. And the thing that I think the Broncos shouldn't do and shouldn't get into the arena of, which they've already gotten to, is continue to just push these assets down the line. They're trading so many picks because you do not afford yourself that opportunity for a safety net. If the Broncos were to say, let's start this rebuild now, we don't think we like what we have with Wilson, we don't like where we're at, it would take multiple years just to put themselves in a place to tear it down, to get it to the studs, to do it right. And even let's say, okay, they're bad next year, and then they decide they're going to draft a quarterback. That's awesome. But the biggest glitch right now in the NFL is winning with a rookie contract quarterback because you can build around the roster. Well, the Broncos will not have had the assets or have the assets in the future to build around that rookie quarterback. So even if in the dream scenario you have Caleb Williams and he's awesome, you might not be able to build anything around him. So right now, I think it's about trying to figure out what's best for this team, because this is the best situation you're going to be in. And for me, it's about continuing to just provide a bunch of darts at the dartboard for around Russell Wilson and hoping some of them hit, rather than, okay, let's take one big swing. They've taken a lot of big swings. None of the big swings have done that well for them so far.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned the whole Caleb Williams notion and how that ties into Russell Wilson, because if they have to move on from Russell Wilson after this year, and I believe you guys talked about on Coffee Break, I know we talked about on Orange and Blue Today earlier this week, the Keyshawn Johnson comments regarding Sean Payton and a willingness to move on from Russ if things don't work out, which kind of goes hand in hand with what we've been talking about the last couple of months regarding his contract. And like, okay, if you can't get him right, get out before it gets any worse. Because if you cut him before next year, you're on the hook for $85 million in dead money, and that's bad. You'll spread it over a couple of years with the post June 1 designation. But if you, even with that, that means you're going to have to make up for all that dead money under your cap with hitting on draft picks and having as much draft capital as you can to make up, to have cost control players of quality to make up for this big gaping hole you're going to have under your cap for a couple of years. And this is where there are limits to what the Walton, Penner, Largesse can do, because unfortunately, if Russell Wilson, you can't get him right, you can't buy your way around that. But even as bad as $85 million is, Jake, it's better than $122 million, which is what you'd be looking at if you did have Russell Wilson on your roster for 2024 and you weren't able to get him right. So there's so much in play here.
And by the way, because salary is going to be such an issue moving forward, there's a pretty significant difference between first and second round picks and fourth, fifth, and sixth round picks and money they make.
Yes.
And we are at the point with the Broncos in their salary cap where I don't think it's fair to look at them at value. We cannot appropriate, hey, player A is worth this value and player B is worth this value, so player A is better. Well, if player B is making significantly less money than player A, then player B actually has a crap ton more money.
I know what you were trying to say. You wanted to say.
I've been on air too much today, mate. A crap ton more money.
Yeah.
They'll have it's a crap ton more valuable to the Broncos to have a player that's slightly worse, but is making a lot less money.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why, that's one of the reasons why I think in trade conversations, the other reason is obviously recency of injury, but why you hear about Cortland Sutton being tradable, but not Tim Patrick, because look, they are comparable players in a lot of ways. Their skill sets aren't exactly the same, but there's a decent amount of crossover on the Venn diagram between the two of them. Yeah. But Cortland Sutton is much more expensive contractually than Tim Patrick is.
And the thing is, it's not like the other 31 teams don't know this. Like, it's not a secret, right? Like, that's the fun thing I always do, Mace, when I'm talking sports. It's like, oh, yeah, you just trade all your bad players and get the good ones back. You know, I was talking to Mike Malone and the Nuggets about this the other day, and they were talking about an issue that they had internally, and one of them said off the record to me, it's like, you know, all the other teams in the league know what's going on here. It's not like they don't have little birdies and little eyes, and, you know, it's not like they don't follow what's going on in the news. So, yeah, you know, I think with Tim and Cortland, that Venn diagram, in a perfect world, one of them is your number 2 receiver because Jerry Jeudy is that number 1 guy. You probably don't need 2 number 2 receivers in a Sean Payton system with the way Russell Wilson throws the ball, planning to run the ball more. So it makes all the sense in the world that you would trade Cortland Sutton and add to your draft capital. I've been the biggest fan of trading Cortland Sutton for a while now. I think it's, you know, you're not selling high on him, unfortunately, but you have the ability to move on from him in a way that makes sense with your weapons. And it's funny to say that, Mace, because it's like the Broncos offense was horrid last year. And why would you be taking weapons away from Russ? But in this case, it actually makes sense because you could very easily stack up a good weapon for Russ, whether it be, you know, a running back that eventually turns into a 2-headed monster with, you know, Javonte, let's say a 3rd or 4th round guy, or historically, guards have been really good in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th round, and the Broncos need all the help I still think they can get on the offensive line. I'm not sold on McGlinchey. I'm really not. And I'm not sold on the guys they have on their offensive line.
Yeah, I mean, McGlinchey, I think he might be able to stop the revolving door. I think it's a question of whether he ends up being worth that contract at right tackle, because that's a big number. I have much more confidence in Ben Powers on the inside. I'd say probably at this moment, I have a pretty good amount of confidence in Ben Powers and Quinn Miners as the guards. Everywhere else I have questions. Now, McGlinchey is going to start. It's just a question of, can he come reasonably close to being worth what that contract says he was? The odds are it's going to end up as an overpay for the Broncos. But sometimes you have to do that in order to fix a spot. But again, in free agency, you always have to ask yourself, why was a team willing to let him go? The 49ers, you get reporters from San Francisco, and you get Kyle Shanahan at the league meeting saying how highly he thinks of Mike McGlinchey. But it's like, okay, fine. You still chose to let him walk.
Why has a team that has seemingly made every right decision for the last 5 years let him go? That's the question. And Mace, to your point, we might have to overpay to solve this problem here. Well, they overpaid to solve the problem at quarterback. They're overpaying to solve the problem here. They're overpaying to solve the problem here. At a certain point, you run out of money.
Yeah.
And that's the part that's really scary about the Broncos' future and the desperation I feel from the franchise to turn this thing around right now. It is because the cupboards are bare, both in money and in assets. And I think it does make the sense, and I'm seeing our comments talk about you wouldn't get more than a 4th-round pick for Cortland Sutton. I'm fine with that. I'm really fine with that. You would be too?
Yeah, because you're getting out from the contract. Frankly, I don't think you can ask more than a 4th-round pick for a guy who is an overpay on his contract. You'll absorb some of it, but you're going to have a significant savings by trading him. You're going to absorb some of what's left on the signing bonus that you gave him, but if you trade him to Baltimore, and we know Baltimore is in the mix, that was reported earlier this week before they signed Odell Beckham Jr. That it was reported yesterday by a reporter from The Athletic that guess what? They were in the mix for Cortland Sutton talking about, but the Broncos wanted too much, right? And when I heard that, I kind of got Colorado Rockies flashbacks a little bit because nobody overvalues their own players quite like the Colorado Rockies, I would argue, in any sport.
Yeah, I can tell you many stories about that one, Mace, but this is a football show.
Yes, but yes, that's basically where it is, and I thought, I didn't like that. But what the Broncos are hoping, to just take it to where they're seeing it, they are hoping that the draft and what Sean Payton believes to be a relatively weak wide receiver class spurs a team as you get closer to the draft as they're finalizing their draft boards and are evaluating how they expect the draft to go, to say, all right, we need a receiver. We don't like what's going to be in front of us. Maybe we give a little more for Cortland Sutton than the Ravens were offering.
Again, we're having the conversation of relative value instead of real value.
Yeah.
You could make a case that Cortland Sutton will be a better player next year than the 2nd or 3rd best receivers in this class, the way this is going. So for a team that's not worried about the contract, it would make sense for them to trade a 4th-round pick for Cortland Sutton if they do believe they're going to be competitive next year. But let me ask you this, because the way the Broncos' assets are right now with their draft picks, they're not just going to be able to trade into the 1st or 2nd round again unless they're really trading down the line draft picks or players, but it would really be players.
Yeah.
So who in your mind is that expendable starter that would make sense for them to trade and they'd get something of real value back?
I mean, really, Cortland is probably number 1 on that list. More so than Jerry Jeudy. I mean, the thing with Jerry Jeudy, you'd be trading him when his value was getting higher, so you get more back, but with all respect to Cortland Sutton and Tim Patrick, the only one who has real number 1 wide receiver capability in that room is Jerry Jeudy. And you do have to, I believe, give Russell Wilson a fair shot. So unless somebody blows you away with an offer for Jerry Jeudy, like a 1st-round pick to where you could say, okay, fine, we'll turn around and take Jalen Hyatt out of Tennessee and basically try to do like a 1-for-1 and restart the clock with a young receiver. Unless you can do that kind of deal, I don't think you trade Jeudy. So expendable starters, I think you're looking at Cortland Sutton. I'm not sure Garrett Bowles is an expendable starter at this point, just because I don't think you would get enough to have a smooth replacement at this point. So I don't think he qualifies. If you go on the defensive side, it's kind of interesting because you just signed Alex Singleton. You do have Jonas Griffith coming back from an injury who has started for you. In fact, was your starter until he got injured last year. So someone who's a fan favorite and who's a pretty good player, but is limited as a coverage linebacker. I'd look at Josie Jewell being somebody who could be considered expendable, but I don't think you're getting that much for an off-ball linebacker heading into his 6th season. I think you're probably picking up a 4th or a 5th round pick for him if he were on the market.
What's the thing that the Broncos could realistically trade that gets them the most value?
Jerry Jeudy, if we're talking about any possibility, it'd be PS2, but they're not trading Pat Surtain.
It's not realistic.
They're not trading Justin Simmons. It still is Jerry Jeudy because the way Sean Payton was talking at the Combine when he had his press conference with media, he did very strongly note that they expected more offers to come in. He noted the weakness of the draft class. He didn't say they were foundational players, but he did say that he liked them. But at the same time, they know their phone is going to ring. So I'd still say I don't expect Jerry Jeudy to be traded, but if somebody looked at how the first round was falling and their receivers were off that they wanted were off the board, that's a case where the phone might ring on draft night, that Thursday night, with an offer the Broncos might consider.
Right. Where I'm at, Mace, at least on the offensive side of the ball, is there's not a single guy I think I would trade on the offensive side of the ball aside for Cortland Sutton. Mm-hmm. And it's because their value is not that high. You need the offense to be a lot better, so you need the talent, and you don't need question marks of rookies. What I will say is, if you're trading Jeudy, you're basically saying Greg Dulcich is ready to be a Travis Kelce type tight end of a number 1 tight end, wide receiver guy, and he's obviously not there. And Russell Wilson's obviously not a top 5 quarterback in the league anymore. So I don't think he's going to be able to work miracles with a 3rd round tight end from 2 years ago and a bunch of number 2s. So where I turn this back onto is this. Your defense was unbelievable for most of the last season last year, and you could tell any GM or any executives in the league, hey, the only reason they tailed off at the end is because we fired the coach and the guys they weren't locked in. And they're going to be like, all right, that's reasonable. So you are at a point with most of your defense that you can sell high on those guys. And I'm not talking about trading PS2. I don't think that's realistic or something that they should do. But when you talk about Jonas Griffith, when you talk about Justin Simmons, when you talk about these guys, I think it makes a lot of sense to trade some of these guys to get 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th round picks, whatever you can get, because you're dealing from a place of strength to bolster your offense when you desperately need the help on offense. Yeah. Now, if you can deal one of those guys and you feel really great about the receivers you're coming in drafting or the running backs you're getting in drafting, then all of a sudden maybe you can deal some of those guys on offense for later picks to help supplement the defense. But you're really turning over the roster at that point, which I wouldn't be entirely surprised if they did, again, because they have a brand new coach who is the boss in town.
Right. And the other thing that kind of looms over this, with that brand new coach and turning over the rosters, as we get into training camp and the end of the preseason, there are going to be some cuts and moves that shock Broncos fans. Mm-hmm. It is usually part and parcel with a new coach. I mean, shoot, when Vance Joseph came here as the head coach in 2017, what was his big move at the end of preseason? It was cutting TJ Ward, breaking up the no-fly zone, right then and there. Now, the thing about that move itself, it actually was a pretty solid move because it got Justin Simmons into the starting lineup. We know what he has become, and TJ Ward never came close to approximating what he was in Denver. So it was one of those things in terms of the personnel as individually, it was probably the right move, even though in terms of locker room culture, it might have been the wrong move.
So obviously this team's in need of a lot of help. And I want to throw this out to our viewers. where do they think? What's the number one thing the Broncos need to improve right now in this draft? What's the position they need to make an upgrade at, whether it be a trade or actual draft pick? Mace, I throw that question to you. I've got my own answer, but I am fascinated by what's the biggest thing the Broncos could do to improve their team going into next year in this next little offseason period.
Well, given what you have draft capital-wise, it's probably not going to be a premium position. Like, I'd love them to upgrade edge rusher.
Yep.
But the problem is when you get to late second, early third round, edge rusher's kind of like quarterback, right? It's hard to find somebody who's a premium player once you get outside the top 15. Now, you can find guys who develop. In 2017, Sean Payton and the Saints drafted Trey Hendrickson. Or was it 17 or 18, one of those 2 years, out of Florida Atlantic. He eventually became a good player for the Saints and became a terrific player in Cincinnati after leaving free agency, but it took him some time. So what positions could impact the Broncos and help them right away if they stand pat in the draft? It's running back, it's tight end, and I think if you go to the defensive side, and I wrote about some of these defensive linemen at denversports.com today. I think it's interior defensive line. You did lose Deshaun Williams. You lost Draymond Jones. You picked up Zach Allen, obviously. But right now, you're leaning on either Eni Iwazurike or Matt Henningsen to make a leap. It's pretty thin there right now. The guy I like most in terms of a guy who could fall to the Broncos is Keanu Benton. But if he's sitting there around 50, 55, I wonder if you think about moving up and getting him, because I think he could fortify that right away. But then the problem is you're not able to focus on the offense, because in order to make that kind of move up, you've probably got to sacrifice some capital that would allow you to target tight end or wide receiver or running back, pardon me.
You know, Brad, I'm going to call you out here, and I feel bad. And you did a little thing that Mace did too. Edge, tight end, safety, tight end, O-line. One, you can't. So you want two tight ends, apparently. But
those are five. There are 5 picks. Maybe that's Brad's plan for the entire draft.
Brad, I appreciate it, but I said one. I said one position. Give me one position.
And I'm
And it's all right, Mace, because you're thorough. You've got details. You've got great information. To me, it's if you're trading. My point is, if you're trading up into the first round, which is probably not happening, but if you're trading up into the first round, what's that swing for? And to me, it's clearly an edge rusher. Yeah. They need an edge rusher. That defensive line was not the same after Chubb was gone. You have to also go back to the start of training camp last year and say, hey, they traded Malik Reed too. Like, this team has worn through some of those edge rushers. So I think if you're trading up, you need an edge rusher. Now, what you just said, Mace, if they're trading back down and they're accumulating some assets, I'd love them to take a swing at a running back. I'd love them to take a swing at a guard, an inside linebacker, and a tight end. That's great. But I bring this question up because we're doing the Sean Payton, getting into Sean Payton's head of trading up for quality. So what would that position be? And in my mind, it's an edge rusher.
Yeah, and of course, DMAC wrote today about the notion of trading up for an offensive tackle. And that would make sense, but also, correct me if I'm wrong, his proposal was trade Garrett Bowles for a first-round pick, right? That's his notion.
Yeah.
Garrett Bowles coming off an injury, I don't think you're getting a first-round pick for him.
Mace, you can always trade the bad players for good players. Yes. It's always possible.
You ever watch Seinfeld? How much Seinfeld did you watch, Jake?
I'm Jewish, Mace. I've watched every episode front and back.
All right. So do you know when, as a baseball guy as well, you would appreciate the scene where George Costanza says he has the idea to get Bonds and Griffey, and we wouldn't even have to give up that much.
Right.
Oh, I feel like that's how everyone views it. Like, oh, we could get this superstar, and we wouldn't have to surrender a lot. No, but that's not the way it works. You got to sacrifice something. Look, you trade for Russell Wilson, and yes, that trade hasn't worked out. But to trade for Russell Wilson, you had to make a trade that hurt. And when we're sitting here talking about all this that you can't do, and we're trying to figure things out because of the lack of draft capital, well, that shows you how much it hurt to trade for Russell Wilson, what the Broncos haven't been able to do. I mean, shoot, look at what Seattle did with the picks they got. last year. And what are they going to do this year? I mean, what if the end result is Seattle gets Anthony Richardson and develops him into a standout quarterback? I mean,
That's not going to, Mace, Anthony Richardson's never going to be a standout quarterback.
okay. I hope, yeah. I don't think so either, but I've been wrong before. I'll be wrong again. I mean, I'll say this. I like him better than Will Levis. I mean, I'd say probably he's my QB4 because I still have Hendon Hooker as my QB3.
You know what Will Levis is doing somewhere right now? He's dumping the mayo into
the coffee. Oh, man.
I can't draft the guy who does that. I'm sorry. It might be like an old baseball scout guy where it's like, his girlfriend's not hot enough like you see in Moneyball. To me, It's like, if you put mayo in your coffee and you're my decision maker, you're my gunslinger, I can't trust you to make decisions.
I've had enough conversations with scouts over the years, and maybe some of these older school scouts are cycling out, but I'm sure that there are people in those rooms who have said, mayo in the coffee, I can't trust a guy like that with our franchise. And that's another thing, a quarterback, you're trusting him with the franchise, basically. I mean, who's to say that David Tepper, who owns the Panthers and apparently is going to have some say in who the Panthers take number 1 overall, who's to say that David Tepper isn't sitting there in downtown Charlotte in his office saying, mayo in the coffee? I can't trust my asset for which I paid $2.5 billion, which seems kind of quaint right now with the Broncos and Commanders prices, but I can't trust this asset to a guy who puts mayo in his coffee.
Right, and it wouldn't be the first time something crazy happened like that, because as everyone knows, or maybe not this crowd because this is more of a football crowd, but as almost all of us that know the Rockies well know, the Rockies passed on several Hall of Famers to draft a pitching prospect because he was more likely to drive their kids to church than the other ones. They felt. They didn't even know that for sure.
Oh my gosh.
That's a good way to end the Friday. Mace,
that is.
Mace, what are you doing this weekend? Give us an inside the life. What's going on?
Inside the life. Well, let's see. Gonna hang out with my daughter, take her to her Irish dance practice one day. Gonna probably take the dogs for a few walks. Gonna watch some baseball. Gonna watch some playoff basketball. Of course, probably post a draft piece or two. One over the weekend, one for Monday. I'm gonna grill at least one day because the weather. Although the weather you got in Colorado, it's coming here to Wisconsin. We've got one more nice day before we return to the wintry mix type of thing here. But I'll probably grill before the weather gets nasty, and just enjoy the off-season weekends. That's another thing. I try to make the most of the 6 months a year of the off season when I have the weekends to myself, because once we get into training camp, I don't, other than the bye week and Thursday night football, I have no weekends. So it's actually kind of trying to get away from things a little bit. I know you're going to be at Ball Arena. You're going to be there for practice tomorrow, right? And then Sunday for the game.
Dude, I don't have a night off, a day off. This is my September football season.
Yes,
that you get. But it's funny because I tried to take it easy yesterday, and it ended up with me writing 5 articles. But my fiance comes home from work, and me and you are the only people in our entire company that this would happen to. She's like, "How was your day?" I was like, "It was pretty solid. I watched the entire Orioles-A's game." She's like, "Why'd you do that?" I'm like, "I don't know, but it was a good game. Andy Rushman hit a walk-off."
Yeah, like I guess I picked the wrong game because even though it was historically significant, yesterday as I went about my business working and then running an errand, I was listening /following Rays Red Sox as the Rays pulled away and got 13 in a row. And so I guess the preview of tonight, I'm going to have to peek in on the Rays to see if they set the record, the modern record, breaking the 82 Atlanta Braves and the 87 Milwaukee Brewers, and get to 14-0 tonight. Wow. And they're
NBA playing one screen, Avs one screen for me, and then the Rays on maybe my phone.
Yeah, this is why I've got my laptop, I got my iPad, I have a television. It's a multiple screen night. It often is. So that's the preview inside our worlds. We are multi-screen people. Jake, appreciate you jumping on. Thanks to everyone for watching. We'll be back on Monday. Cecil is going to be here. And, of course, thank you for watching Orange and Blue today. It's brought to you by our friends over at Champ Honda. We'll see you next week when the Broncos probably have another